McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Welcome. I'm Dennis McCuistion, and on this program, my co-host Jim Falk and I are going to interview Steve Moore, and we've also interviewed Ken Hirsch about these kind of topics about the economy in the wake of the pandemic that we're experiencing and what should be done for the future and sort of what the damages have been as well. So I think most of you who are watching this program now have seen my co-host Jim Falk. He's the CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Jim, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Always good to be here.
Yep. And for longtime viewers of the McCuistion program, over 30 years, you can see Steve Moore. And Steve, like Jim Falk and me, has gotten a little gray hair over the years as well. Steve, welcome back to the program.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
You spend a lot of your time in front of a camera these days, Steve, but you and I go back a long way to when you were in the think tank business. You still are in the think tank business, obviously, with Heritage and with this Unleash the Prosperity that you're working on now and other things as well. Can you give us some thoughts about how you see energy, not just in Texas, but in the country and actually worldwide, the issues with Saudi and issues with the Russians and what you see in terms of energy?
There's no question that Saudi Arabia and the Russians have a plan, scheme, I should say, to try to put our oil and gas industry out of business, but I think it will fail. Now, I'm not in favor of tariffs or other kind of import fees, because ultimately, even though this hurts the oil and gas industry, and it does, it's causing great pain in Oklahoma and Texas and North Dakota and Pennsylvania and Ohio. For the people who use oil and gas, it's a good thing, right? Because it means the cost of energy is lower. So my bottom line is, I think that they're going to get through this. I think we're going to continue to have a vibrant oil and gas industry right now. But let's face it, Dennis, this is an industry that's really been hit by the exact coronavirus that is decimating our airline industry, our retail stores. This is the catastrophe that really has now hit the oil and gas industry.
Well, you mentioned the airlines, so let's talk about that. I did an op-ed piece recently for the Dallas Business Journal in which I talked about American Airlines and some of the other.
Oh, careful, because you're there in Dallas. You don't want to.
We're right here. We're right here, and we all love American. Yeah, and here's
Southwest.
Yeah, and Southwest too, of course. Yeah. So, but here's the issue. American and all these airlines spent the last few years taking all of their earnings, virtually 96% of their free cash flow, Steve, and buying their stocks back. Now, American has gotten over $5 billion as a grant out of the taxpayer's pocket, a couple of low interest loans of another $5 billion. And so that sort of gets all over me as a free market person, is that, you know, you spend all your money buying stock back, you don't have any cash, don't have any capital, and now you want a bailout.
Yeah, so I'm very much in favor of any grants to industries, and we've made this. That's been a problem with a lot of these industries. They're getting grants. I am in favor, and I work with Steve Forbes and Art Laffer, and we've all recommended loans to industries like the airlines and to small mom and pop shops that were successful companies 2 months ago and now are facing, you know, dire straits because of the shutdown of the economy. But you shouldn't give these companies grants, because then it's just free money and it's treated as such. So I have no problem with a low interest loan to industries that have been affected by the government, because remember, it was the government. This is a man-made crisis, right? It's not an act of nature. But I think that the money has to be paid back to taxpayers.
Your former employer, the Wall Street Journal, particularly the editorial page, had a couple of articles today from people you and I both know well. One you know very well, and that's Dan Henninger's article about laissez-faire capitalism. I don't know if you saw that article today or not, but he says, let's get back to where the private sector can do what the private sector does, because it's going to do it better, it's going to do it more effectively. I think you would agree. The second article, though, was written by Peter Gettler and Robert Levy of the Cato Institute, and they're just talking about they're not going to take a loan, and they wish other people wouldn't, to keep the government out of it. So how do you, as at least someone who used to be sort of limited government, have you embraced more and more government, or do you see this as a possible problem going forward?
It's a huge problem. I mean, this is what's keeping me up at night. I'm glad it's keeping you up at night, Dennis, and hopefully you too, Jim. I mean, we're creating a dependency culture. Businesses are now dependent on government. Individuals, families, workers are dependent on government. Milton Friedman used to joke about taking helicopters and stuffing them with $100 bills and dropping them over cities. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we're doing right now. Now, look, there is need for short-term aid for people and businesses. There's no question about it. I mean, bam, we had the best economy ever, basically 2 months ago. And then all of a sudden we hit this brick wall of the coronavirus, but it's got to be temporary. It's got to be loans. It's got to be repaid. We got to get government the hell out of the way afterwards. And by the way, after this $2.2 trillion spending bill we passed, which keeps getting extended and expanded, there should be no more spending. We did the spending. I'm in favor of a payroll tax suspension for the rest of the year for every business and every worker in America, because it actually rewards people for working and rewards businesses for getting up and hiring people. But you're right. I am disgusted by what's happening in Washington. Pelosi wants $2 trillion more. Donald Trump says he wants a $2 trillion infrastructure bill on top. We could have a $5 trillion deficit easily this year. Never thought I would see the day. So yes, I agree entirely with my old friends at the Cato Institute. We got to get the government out of the way as quickly as possible. That means we've got to get this American economy around the country up and running.
Steve, let me ask you a question. Go back to energy for a second. There's been so much pressure put on fossil fuels and companies, especially even the majors, in the last few years. Now, do you think that with the virus, we're going to see sort of a move away from renewables because the price is so low, or will it be the opposite?
That's a great question. And the left, there's always a reason to turn to green energy. So they've been saying, oh, look at all the problems the oil and gas industry has. Now we should move to green energy. Are you crazy? The problems they're having is that it's practically free. Why would we turn away from a free energy source and use an energy source that is 10 times more expensive? I mean, it's idiotic to be, there's no future for green energy when you have cheap oil, cheap gas, cheap coal, right? So we should, as a society, be using more oil and gas, not less. I mean, but you're right. This is the argument that many on the left are saying, because oil and gas is so cheap, they say we should move to wind power and solar power, which is so expensive, and that's a non sequitur.
And so a follow-up on that is, you've just written this article that I thought was so interesting about this degrowth movement, and you're seeing that really escalate on college campuses, even though they're closed right now.
Maybe, thank goodness, right?
So tell us, I mean, how rampant is this degrowth movement, and really tell us who's behind it and what it means.
Well, as Dennis knows, and I think you may know this, Jim, my mentor and the guy who really taught me economics was the great Julian Simon, who taught us that there's never a shortage of resources. The most important resource on this planet is the human mind. It always, the new technology and the know-how and ingenuity of the human mind is what creates everything that we have. And so we need to be using our resources in a way. Look, there's no country in the world that has more resources than we do. And so we ought to be using them at this time. And we have to move to, I've never been so nervous about the future of our country as I am right now. My parents used to talk about the Great Depression and then World War II and Vietnam. Of course, I lived through Vietnam War and 9/11. But right now, I am very frightened about where our country, I don't know about you, Jim, but I find what's happening with the expansion of, we just talked about $5-6 trillion of additional government spending and debt. And then the freedoms that are being abridged. Remember Easter Sunday, when many states shut down Easter services, which to me seems to be a violation of the First Amendment. I don't know about you guys, but you're seeing curfews in towns, martial law, surveillance. I think that's Orwellian. And by the way, it's interesting. Did you see that the #9 book on the New York Times bestseller list is 1984?
Yeah, but let me push back a little bit on that because, when someone is attending a church service on Easter Sunday, in effect, they're putting people at risk, not Sunday, but now for the next week.
So, my argument is that if people don't want to, if people are worried about that, they shouldn't go to the Easter service. And a lot of these places, some of them they were just staying in their car, and some of them they were social distancing from each other. I'm just saying.
Well, that's a
I've
different
never-
situation if they're really social
Yeah.
distancing.
So my only point is that we've really expanded the power of government. Look, I live in Maryland, and we've been in lockdown for a long time. Our governor won't even let us play golf by ourselves. Now, that's the ultimate form of social distancing, right? Being out in the middle of the fairway where there's nobody within 100 yards of you. So I am really worried about this because this is a prelude. What's going on right now is a trial run for what's going to happen when we have the climate change movement. If they could take all these rights away from us to save 10,000 lives, they can certainly, take every right away from us if they want to save the planet, right? So I'm very nervous about the future of freedom and liberty and prosperity in this country.
Well, you're
Right,
on,
Steve,
on
I
the
wanna-
president's committee.
Yep.
And one of the things, of course, is when will the United States open up? When will business open up?
Mhm.
How do you balance this situation when, best of my knowledge, there still is not adequate testing?
Well, first of all, my opinion is, this is just one man's opinion, but I believe that the shutdown of our economy was one of the greatest abuses of power by government in maybe the history of this country. And it was one of the worst decisions from just a standpoint of human health and protecting the citizenry. Because, as we speak, there are some 25 million people who have been put on unemployment lines. The people who have been hurt the most by this are the least among us, the lowest income people. You've seen the pictures of cities like Pittsburgh, mile-long lines to go to the food banks because people are living without income. You can't have a society. You cannot have a society without an economy, without people producing things. And I think this was I have at least 3 or 4 good friends who contracted coronavirus. 2 of them got so sick that we didn't even know if they were going to make it through the weekend. So I'm not diminishing the dangers of this virus, but I don't understand the mentality that says we have to shut down the American economy to keep us safe. I find that to be horrifying. And I think most Americans have no idea how bad it's going to be this summer because we made this horrendous decision of just shutting down the American economy rather than being smart about it and picking certain populations. We know that the vast majority of people who die from this terrible virus are people of the age of 75. We know most of the rest are people who have chronic diseases. What we should have done, I mean, it just seems so patently obvious, we should have sequestered and isolated the people who are vulnerable, senior citizens, people in nursing homes, people with chronic diseases. But for the rest of the population, it really isn't much different from the flu. And so I do think we made some big mistakes here. And most people disagree with me on that, but I think that we could face a Great Depression, and the human misery attached with that kind of situation is an order of magnitude worse than this virus, in my opinion. But Dennis, I think you're going to have to be the tiebreaker here.
Yeah, well, I'm more with you, I can assure you. But here's the thing, a lot of our friends on the left point to Sweden when they want to talk about democratic socialism.
Right.
Sweden is an example of a country that hasn't done what most other countries have done. Germany's talking about starting to reopen next week. Now, you've just been put on one of President Trump's task forces of opening the economy. So what do you see in terms of how this might work and then what the timeline might be?
Well, what you're seeing so far is that the red states are starting to open and the blue states are staying closed. Isn't that interesting? I mean, this has been kind of an ideological divide in America about the difference between the kind of more conservative states and the more liberal states. And so you're going to see states like Tennessee, and you're going to see states like Utah, and you're states like Arizona, and states like Missouri that are opening up in safe ways. By the way, Jim, you're exactly right about the testing. The more testing, the better. And we need treatments, and we need social distancing for a while. We're going to need gloves. We're going to need vaccine. Well, we'd love to have a vaccine, but that's going to take a while. But in any case, you use the best practices, and you get America back to work. We can't live in fear, in my opinion. And so you are going to see states like the great state of Texas could lead the way here. And show New York how to do it, right? Because you've got a great governor there, and Greg Abbott, who I greatly admire, who's saying, yes, we have to be very sensitive about this, and we have to put priority number one is to save lives. But that doesn't mean we shut down the great Lone Star State economy.
And clearly in Texas, I mean, we have such a difference between the rural and the urban, which would make it easier.
Point. Jim, that's a really important point you just made, because what you need to do, and this is what the White House plan is, and they're executing this now as we speak, is looking at counties, looking at zip codes. I don't know how many cases you've had there in Dallas. Houston, obviously, the big urban centers are, look, whenever you have a pandemic, these are urban diseases, right? That's true of every major disease. And so Texas, as I seem to recall, is a very, very, very big state, right? I tried to drive across it. It took me 3 days. So, what's happening in Dallas may not be happening in Midland or other places.
Well, and you've talked about the fiscal policy issues, which you and I have talked about the debt over the years so many times, and you've talked many times about how we can grow our way out of it. I and Dave Walker have said we can't grow our way out of $1 deficits, and I don't think we can. But the last time that we saw each other was last year, Steve. You came in for my institute at the University of Texas at Dallas. And when you first came in April, you were talked about by President Trump as maybe being put up for the Federal Reserve Board. It went away later because of reasons you and I know and we don't need to discuss. But the Fed, you've been negative on Jay Powell. Obviously, President Trump's been very negative on him. But what's happened with the Fed now with these low interest rates, which I believe caused a lot of the problems in the last 20 years, by the way, you know where I'm coming from. But what they've done now, number one, do you think it was necessary? Secondly, do you think it will work? And then third, is there any chance that we can put the genie back in the bottle, which we never did after 2008 and 2009 from a monetary policy standpoint?
Yeah, boy, there's a lot there. And Dennis, this is what we did. This is the monetary easing on steroids, right? And I have to say, I certainly don't agree with everything that Jerome Powell has done, but I do agree with the direction he's taken things. We do not have an inflation problem in this country. We do not. There's no inflation. In fact, in March and April, prices have been falling. They're not rising. So it makes a lot of sense to flood liquidity into the economy to prevent deflation. One of the reasons deflation is happening is number one, demand is down, but number two, everybody wants dollars, right? And anytime you have an international crisis, there's a flood for owning dollars. And if you don't accommodate that demand for dollars with the supply, you're going to see rapid deflation. And you're a student of history, both of you are. You know that during the Great Depression, we had very severe deflation, and deflation can be worse than inflation. What I don't like, Dennis, and I'm sure this is where you and we may disagree on that first point, but I think we'll agree on the second point, that now we have the Fed basically playing the role of a commercial bank, and they're making the loans. I mean, they're making the loans, they're guaranteeing the loans, they're picking industrial winners and losers. Dennis, you tell me where in the Fed's charter they have the authority to do that.
Well, see, that's the thing that bothers me about not only the Fed, but obviously the federal government as well, and getting outside their constitutional bounds. Of course. I worry about the president talking about that. He backs off on most of these things, as you know. Yeah. But I don't think they have the authority to do that. But secondly, they certainly don't have the ability. And you will recall the great book that Walter Bagehot wrote in the late 19th century about the Bank of England, when he said, in times like this, you loan against good collateral to sound borrowers. Yes. with at high penalty rates. But what we did in 2008 and 2009 and what we're doing now is loaning to the weakest with the weakest collateral at low rates. Exactly the opposite.
Yep, yep. And by the way, that Walter Baggett quote that you just did, Arthur Laffer and I have been citing that many times because that's exactly what you do. You loan with collateralized companies, and we moved away from that. And look, I can't defend what's happening. I think it's horrifying. And I made this point before, but I need to make it again. This is not an act of nature. The virus is not the problem. It's the response. It's the government response to the virus, which is the problem. And I think it's been outsized. I think the damage we're doing to our society is possibly an order of magnitude larger than the dangers of this virus. I really do. I think we could lose all of 2020. We could go into a Great Depression. We could see 20% unemployment rates. I remember I said my parents lived of the Depression era. They talked about it all the time. The one thing you learn when you have parents of the Depression era is you eat every single crumb on your plate, right? And so they told me how bad that was. And I hope I'm wrong, by the way. I love this great country. I think, the frustration that I have is we just 2 months ago, we had the best economy ever. Then bam, we're hit with this virus, this massive overreaction by government, this massive assumption of power. And I'm sorry, I think it's ridiculous. My parents lived through the polio epidemic. Polio was much worse than coronavirus. No question about it. People were paralyzed. Kids were paralyzed. Everybody knew people in neighborhoods who had it. Do you think we shut down our economy in the polio epidemic? And we would never, it would have been unthinkable. Why are we so different today than we were then?
Do you think the Fed acted too quickly? And so what's left in their toolbox?
No, I don't think they acted too quickly. I actually think the Fed's done a pretty good job in reaction to the coronavirus. The question, you raise a good question, Jim. What is left in there? They've thrown everything they've got at this, and they're buying up everything. I mean, they're buying up all the debt in the country. They're buying up foreign debt. I mean, it's kind of frightening to see. And this gets to the point that Dennis was making is how do we unwind from this? Dennis, I don't have a clue. I mean, it's scary.
Yeah, well, Steve, I want to ask you this, because and see also what Dennis says. It seems like the European countries have really approached a different way to do stimulus. They have provided funds to companies to keep the employees in place, even if it's a reduced salaries. Yeah, while in the United States, people are laid off or furloughed. What do you think is, do you see any merits in the European approach?
The only thing that can stimulate the economy, there's only one thing that can stimulate the economy. Get the American economy up and running again. All of these government programs probably are making things worse, not better. So I shudder when we even talk about, quote, government stimulus. Dennis, I don't think there's any such thing as government stimulus. I mean,
And see, Steve, friends of mine get tired of me saying this. So I want.
I learned this from you.
I know. Well, no, you didn't learn it from me. But I want you to tell them where the government gets its money. Right. I think people think, well, we need a government bailout, as if government somehow has money laying around.
Look, it's very simple. Let's say we have a 3-person economy. It's you and me and Jim, right? And all of a sudden we're going to, the quote government is going to give you, Dennis, money. They're going to give you $1 million. Well, where does the $1 million have to come from? It has to, the only place it can come from is from Jim and me, right?
I like that. I like that.
You're the winner.
Let me check my pockets.
Peter, if you rob Peter, pay Paul. Paul's always very happy. But all you're doing, you guys know this, all you're doing when you have all these handout programs, we're going to give unemployment insurance, this benefit someone else. I mean, Milton Friedman, of course, is the one who taught us this, that when the government redistributes, it's just taking money from one person and giving it to another. That's not a stimulus. Now, I'm not saying I'm not trying to be cold-hearted. We don't want people to go hungry. We don't want to be people go homeless, not being able to pay their rent or mortgage, but it doesn't stimulate the economy. Okay?
Steve, it won't surprise you. I have an international question to ask you. Right now, you're seeing pressure and protest in Mexico, Obrador, what's happening in Venezuela, as well as in Brazil.
Yes.
What do you think may happen here? Do you think we're going to see some real change in sort of the populist governments, perhaps?
Could be. I mean, obviously, you need to change the government in Venezuela. You know. And by the way, people should look at what's happening in Venezuela because, unfortunately, we're adopting the policies of these countries. This is a little bit off your question, but when Bernie Sanders announced he was dropping out of the race, he gave his speech and endorsed Biden, but he said, I may have lost this race, but my ideas have really taken hold. And frankly, his ideas have taken hold. I don't think even in his wildest dreams, he would have seen this kind of government takeover of our economy. We have to take back our freedoms. We have to take back our prosperity. We have to take back our free enterprise system, and we have to stop looking at government as the solution to our problems, because the government is the source of our problems, to quote Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, and we just have a minute or so left. Steve, a guy that you know well, and I know, Bob Higgs, wrote a book I think we all enjoy, which is called Crisis in Leviathan. I don't know that we enjoy it, but once a government gets bigger, whether it's through a war or some other crisis like we had 12 years ago and like we're having now, it never shrinks back to where it was before. So give us some sort of closing thoughts as to how that viewer watching this can do whatever he or she can do to help this situation.
Yeah, we have to take back our rights. We're starting to see around the country real rebellion. The people who are protesting against these governmental powers that are extraordinary. And we have to do this. This is very much like the civil rights movement of when Martin Luther King and others took back the rights of Black Americans. All our rights are in jeopardy right now. And now is not the time for us to sit back and take it. We need to rise up in rebellion and show us a little civil disobedience, because America is not going to be America. I love the editorial of a week or two ago in the Wall Street Journal that said, "This is still America." And it was just chronicling all of these abuses of power by state governments, local governments, counties, and of course our federal government. And Dennis, that's why one of the reasons I love doing your show. And you can't retire on us, Dennis. We need you for another 10 years. You're not going to leave right in the middle of this crisis. Jim, we need you too.
This is the best time to leave. And Jim, Jim's good hands. Jim, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. Thanks,
Good
Jim.
to see you, Steve. Take care.
We appreciate you. Take care. We've been talking about things that matter, obviously, with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at nikkimcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.